Three, two, one.
Here we go!
Hey everyone, welcome back to Let's Dig In. I'm your host, Rich Rosendale, and today's episode is an absolute treat. We're diving deep into the culinary world with none other than Kyle Connaughton, co-owner of the three-Michelin-starred SingleThread in Healdsburg, California. Kyle's journey is nothing short of extraordinary, starting with a passion for sushi at a young age, training in Japan, and pioneering a unique blend of traditional and modern techniques. From his time at the Fat Duck to launching the innovative Throughline project, Kyle is reimagining how we experience food through storytelling, sustainability, and unforgettable flavors. You do not want to miss this conversation packed with insights, inspiration, and a fresh perspective on what it means to be a chef today. And hey, if you want to see the full experience, head over to Rosendale Collective on YouTube to watch the video version of this episode. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss a bite. Let's dig in.
Thank you so much for being on the show today. And again, I know how busy you are. The last time we connected was on a project we were working with for a company in California, working on some refrigeration equipment, very forward thinking refrigeration. And I know you were traveling, so thank you very much. I know how busy you are with all of your projects. So thanks for spending some time with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So Kyle, I obviously I've been in the circle like with a lot of the chefs in the fine dining that have been like Thomas Keller and Danielle and I think of some of their mentees like Tim Hollingsworth and Gavin, and they've a lot of the chefs that I know, they've had kind of a certain kind of path that they've followed. And why I was really so excited to be able to talk with you is because I feel like you've had a really just a really neat path and very unique. I mean, just with where you were cooking, some of the places that you were cooking, and as I really learned more about your style, which obviously I know of just from the restaurant, but prior to the podcast, I really spent more time trying to understand your philosophy and everything. And I just thought it was just such a unique background and path. And I'm just kind of curious. I just think for the listeners, just to kind of give us just the background of the beginning. I mean, how did you even get into cooking, and what kind of led you through the path of the Japanese inspired and even cooking over there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I grew up mostly in Los Angeles, and my parents are both from England, actually. And so I'm a dual citizen to the UK and in US, and spent a lot of time there in New Zealand also growing up as a result of that. But yeah, my growing up, my dad traveled a lot for his work. He ran a company that made all the Olympic level gymnastics equipment. So wherever those sort of like games were going on, he was spending a lot of time. And then in between sort of the Olympics, he was setting up Olympic training gyms. So in the 80s, Japan was really investing a lot into their national gymnastics program. And so he was spending a lot of time in Japan during those years that I was a kid, growing up in the 80s. And we also lived near a big Japanese expat community, and so he was traveling there quite a bit, and just kind of got really fascinated as a result of that, like of that travel, and getting exposure to that food and to that culture. And we even had Japanese foreign exchange students living with us when I was a kid. So I was definitely around that cuisine and culture, quite a bit, and like kind of fell in love with it really early on, just like really fascinated with that. Like it just kind of had a big impression on me, and they were traveling a lot of different places, and most of the time, if not, much of the time, we were kind of going along as kids. And so I spent a lot of time like sort of in and out of school, and kind of being taken out of school, and taken different places. And I think what was like really disruptive for school was actually like exactly what sort of like led me on on the path that I ended up taking. And I really decided at 9 years old, at a sushi bar, I was like sitting there with my dad watching the chef working, tasting, everything that he was creating. And I was like, this is it. This is like whatever this is, like I just want to be a part of this. And they were super supportive. They didn't sort of like laugh that off. And it sort of like became a thing in our house. And it wasn't like a team sports kid or anything like that. It was like, all right, sort of like this is where we're gonna like follow this. And so that's kind of, from a really young age, that's what I kind of got dedicated to. And as soon as really I was old enough to work, I like went down to the sushi restaurant in our part of, town that was like closest, to us that I had gone to for like years. And I just showed up and I was like, all right, I want to learn how to make sushi. And they did laugh at me and they were like, okay, you can be a busboy. So I kind of started doing that, started in the kitchen, and I went to traditional culinary school in Los Angeles. I went to a school that actually got purchased by the company that then turned it later into the Cordon Bleu. But at the time, it was called Southern California School of Culinary Arts. And I think at that time in the 90s, late 90s, really, if you were going to culinary school, it was really because you really wanted to be a chef. Like it
Right.
wasn't something you fell into, or it wasn't a sort of alternative, or some things. It was kind of like everyone who was in my class was like very dedicated to the craft. It was pretty amazing. And I went to school in the morning, and then, everyone who was in my class, we all worked at night. So I was working at Spago Beverly Hills. Everyone was working for like Michael Cimarusti at Water Grill, or Mark Peel and Nancy Silverton at Campanile. So it was a very like engaged group. And really like a lot of the people that I went to school with, a lot of the young, chefs that I was in school with, they all had like aspirations. It was like go to France, go to France. And at that time it was like go to New York, go to Chicago and work for Charlie Trotter, go up to Napa and work for Thomas Keller, or go to France. Like, it was not the
Right. Those
sort of
are
like rich
the
culinary
options.
landscape that America is today. And for me, I was like Japan, 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 Japan. I just need to get to Japan. And I had, I'd worked in sushi restaurants and, as well as places like Spago and the dining room at the Ritz-Carlton. I worked for a time for Suzanne Goyen at Luke and helped her open AOC, spent some time working at Campanile. So I kind of had a traditional, like also Western, California, French influenced restaurants. But really, it was like for me, it was all about getting into the Japanese restaurants. So I went to a Japanese culinary. I enrolled at a Japanese culinary school, and in Los Angeles in Venice Beach, and I had an amazing instructor there, and he took me to Kobe. I finished my program in Kobe, and then he sent me to do my apprenticeship at his family's sushi restaurant. And so I lived in his like brother's, like the sunroom in his brother's house. And I worked sushi in Japan. And as soon as I came back, I was like, all right, we got to go. And I spent 5 years going to a language tutor, a private tutor, just learning to speak the language. I
Oh,
grew
you
up around
speak Japanese?
language. Sorry.
Do you speak Japanese?
I do, yeah, yeah.
Wow.
So I learned to speak Japanese, reading, writing, the whole thing, and then I spent quite a bit of time trying to, get hired and get visa sponsorship in Japan, which was very, very difficult. Like it just wasn't the time yet where they were. I mean, they were like, well, it was one thing to work at a hotel or something like that, but like to work in Japanese cuisine was like I mean, I was just getting every door slammed in my face no matter what, was happening. And it was just like they couldn't wrap their heads around it and wrap their heads around like sponsoring a visa. And I just kind of persisted. And there was a new hotel opening in Hokkaido up in the North Island. And they had brought Michel Bras in from France and a really amazing kaiseki from Kyoto called Miyamaso. And I reached out and I was like, hey, this property's opening. Like, I want in. I can help with. I can speak. I can help translate. I can, do all these things. And it took 18 months to get my visa, but that was my really my foot in the door. And so I went and worked for both Michel Bras, who I loved, and I was not a big follower of French chefs and French cuisine, but I love Michel Bras so much. His book was so influential. So I got a chance to work for him and from Kaiseki in Kyoto sort of simultaneously. Got to go back and forth between the two restaurants, and it was just incredible. So
Well, that was
that was
another
kind
one.
of that started that, like the actual getting the foot in the door of living and working in Japan.
And that was another one. Just as I looked at your background working with Michelle Bras, I thought was, that was like so cool. I remember seeing that cookbook for the first time, and it was just like such a different style and as such a different, the passion that went into those plates. It was just not something that you've ever seen before. So, again, just I feel like that when you were mentioning before, in that time period, a lot of chefs were basically kind of going toward those like handful of options or channels, and you picking the route to go to Japan. I feel like that really is kind of what set this trajectory that like I said, I feel is really very different than a lot of other of our peers and colleagues. And I just thought it was just a really neat path that it kind of led you on. Now, did I see also that you worked in pastries as well, some pastry?
Yeah, so I kind of started I really wanted to be well-rounded. I knew I wanted to focus on Japanese cuisine. I had experience in sushi, in Japanese cuisine. But then as I was going to culinary school, non-Japanese, just kind of traditional culinary school, it was like, okay, well, I want to also learn, other things. And this is where there's opportunities. And I had some really amazing like mentors and, in my school. Sort of like also pushed me into other directions of like saying like, hey, like try some other stuff as well. So yeah, I did pastry at Spago for a year at the dining room at the Ritz-Carlton, for a year. And yeah, so I like I said, like I just thought and I look back and I was like, I look at younger me and I'm like, I can't believe I actually like at 19, 20, 21, like actually had the level of maturity to at least say to myself like, hey, you're gonna want to be well-rounded later on,
Yeah.
as a chef, because it's like, I think when we mentor, people now, sometimes it's hard to get them to see the bigger picture of the length of their career. But I said like I want to do this, and I want to I want to learn these things. And man, I'm very very happy that I took that time to do the pastry. I'm like every time I'm working with my pastry chef Emma, I'm always just like so thankful that like we can actually like speak the same language, about things and techniques.
I feel like chefs too that have spent some time in pastries, like they have a more of a discipline in the way that they put, menus and plates together. Not to say that people that aren't, that haven't had that, but it's almost like looking at a recipe as a formula and considering the science component of the reaction of when you put this with this. And that probably lent itself well to you kind of going into Japanese cuisine, which has a lot of parallels of like, you know, uh, you know, exactitude and execution and really, that's not always something that everybody really can kind of get their arms around. But I feel like the pastries probably helped you with that.
It's very, very true. And it's like I said, it is funny to think back of like I had that realization at a really young age that was probably true. And it
But a lot of
turned
people
out
don't even want to get
very
into
true.
that
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah. Because there's a period of like, what am I doing? Anything that's not cooking Japanese cuisine is like a waste of time. And
Yeah.
then, I also, I also fell in love with this like kind of idea of the California cuisine and everything as well. And, I was just like, Japan, Japan, Japan all the time. I got to get there. I got to get there. I got to get there. And what's really funny is in getting there and living and working in Japan and then, in Europe, it really gave me an appreciation for California. Like it was one of those things where, you have to leave to really appreciate what you have and not because this isn't about being better or worse or sort of it was just that because of those experiences that I had early on in California with some really great Californian chefs, it really gave me this appreciation for ultimately actually what SingleThread, became, because early on, young and naive in my career, I thought I will eventually open a Japanese restaurant. And then, it was like living and working in Japan, it was like a realization of like, no, that's really never going to happen quite like that. And it shouldn't. And it's like, and not just because I'm not Japanese, like, ethnically, it was just to say like, it's why import something that is going to be not true to what it is. And it what ultimately what I learned from my experiences living and working in Japan was is that the underlying principles, the underlying ethos in philosophy, which is about like reverence for the season, telling the story. We say at SingleThread that we tell the story of today. Is like telling this sort of like story, looking at an alignment of the techniques, how you translate nature in the seasons and convey certain sort of like messages, how you focus on the purity of the ingredient. So all of these things that I was learning, which are like the take away the sort of like the country and the ethnicity of the cuisine, if you just peel that back and you look inside the hood of Japanese cuisine, true Japanese cuisine, like kaiseki cuisine, you sort of realize that there's this all of these underlying principles. And the lesson was really like apply those principles to who you are and where you're from. And and that's exactly what my wife Katina and I, like, because she was farming in Japan, and that's what that was what we learned, where we're like, oh, it doesn't, like, what we do does not have to be inherently a Japanese restaurant. And in fact, that's not right. Like, let's take what we've learned and let's apply that to home. And so for me, it was like taking what I learned in Japan and continue to learn in Japan, by the way, because I'm there all the time and I'm constantly learning, and I'm relearning lessons all the time at different ages. And then taking all of that, what I learned, and inherently just knew from being from California and that being part of our culture and our upbringing and the people that we worked for, and the ethos of what was created here, from Alice Waters and all these amazing chefs in California, what was sort of created within sort of California cuisine. And then what I learned, in England, working for Heston Blumenthal at the Fat Duck, about the importance of story, about the multisensory aspects of the dining technique, how to create a narrative, the underlying science of cooking and how to leverage that, combining modern techniques with ancient cooking techniques, and how to like those. We kind of took those three really sort of cultural lessons, and we really like have brought them together, and that's really what SingleThread is.
What would you say, like from Michel Bras and from Heston? I mean, we kind of already know like there's so much integrated from the whole Japanese experience, but what do you feel like you kind of those experiences kind of contributed to how you cook at Single Thread today, like both Michel Bras and the experience with at Heston?
Yeah, I think, Michel's cuisine and why it worked really well in Japan is like, I think he too is very aligned with that same philosophy and sort of underlying guiding principles, very seasonal, very reverent to nature and agriculture, lots of foraging, lots of storytelling about the season and nature through the cuisine. And so, I think that a lot of the lessons from it was interesting because I was going back and forth working for Michel Bras and Nat Yamaso and in kaiseki and French cuisine. And it was like the palette of ingredients was the same. The intention was the same. And when I say palette of ingredients, I mean mostly like the local vegetables.
Right.
And all of these things were the same. It was just like if it took a Japanese path or a French path, but it was
Okay.
like the underlying principles were all the same. So I think that was very, very influential. Um, on us. And I ran the vegetable section at Michel Bras. So like the gargouille, which is like the dish that's on the cover of the book, is what I made every day. So it was like, like the very purity of flavor and the natural flavors and and those kinds of things were part of that. And then, when I came out to the Fat Duck, which was something that was totally not part of the plan at all,
Yeah.
that sort of, that sort of happened, and I found myself out there as the head chef of the R&D kitchen, and I spent 5 amazing years with him, and that was really like what I was learning there was, he was really focused on, the multi-sensory aspects of the dining experience, and, creating these incredible stories, um, this incredible narrative, and it was like how to really sort of push the boundaries of what's possible, with food, and looking at sight, sound, smell, story, everything to create a dish. And so while it wasn't so much about the season, about the farms and everything like that, it was really about the experience and about the guest experience, and hospitality, and really sort of considered everything, things that I hadn't thought of, because as a chef, I was just so focused on the cuisine and what we were doing in terms of what was on the plate. And he kind of like zoomed out and was like, what is it like through the booking process, and how can we use the 2 months between when you book and when you come to create, an experience? How can we sort of, tell a story that's kind of like wraps up in fantasy and create a different world for you to come into? And, he just challenged sort of everything, looking at the science of cooking and being like, things like, do you really need to add individual ladles of stock into a risotto, or do we just believe that to be true? He just like, and that's just a simple example. He just challenged everything, and it was just kind of amazing, because there just weren't any limitations. It was really like, okay, let's go beyond, and let's do something new and different and challenging. And if that's challenging for some guests, like, that's okay. We're and that was an amazing sort of freedom, and I learned so much from it. And we were working with scientists, perfumeriers, magicians, about how to do, certain sleight of
That's
hand
wild.
moves. Like, we're just working with, I spent a lot of time like working with a perfumier in Geneva, or a food researcher, up in the Lakes District, or I was at Hampton Court Palace pouring through old books from the 1400s and 1500s with the historians, trying to find inspiration for us. I mean, it was just things that, like, just as a chef, you don't, get to do. And, I don't think for the guests, they see when they dine at SingleThread the influence that is, because most of the Fat Ducks dishes are almost like performative in nature. But I always say it's like, for me, all of those lessons and everything like that, it's more in the background, how we think about sight, sound, smell, the story, all of these kinds of things. So for me, it's very, very present. I think for the guest, they see more of Japan, and more of the farm and everything like that, which of course is what we do focus on. But equally, I think these sort of multisensory, lessons are pretty well ingrained in what we do as at SingleThread as well.
Yeah, and I feel like I was watching one of the videos. I think it was like a traditional rice, like a little rice cake that had seasonal vegetables that you use, and it was kind of wrapped in like the bamboo, and kind of in like a nice little, like a little pocket almost. And the way it was presented in the room is almost like a little snack if people were traveling. So I feel like
Oh yeah.
there's nuances of like that experience and creating your own theater, your own story, your own experience, but you're kind of telling it through, your lens, your experience. Um, yeah, and I think for those that don't know, I mean, the Fat Duck, which I had always known about it, the R&D kitchen, but I went over there, several years ago, and we went into the R&D kitchen, and again, for those that are not aware of it, there's literally like a whole R&D separate kitchen, like just for the restaurant. And like that's
Yeah.
all you're doing all the time is just like innovation and new ideas, and wow, just what an I mean, after going from a cuisine that is so based in, you know, accuracy and discipline and just the tradition, and it's almost like a 360 where not that, the Fat Duck doesn't use a lot of classical technique, but they also challenged a lot of that and, did a lot of, as you mentioned, even the risotto being a perfect example. But I feel like that's again, just kind of that unique path that you took. I feel like you've had some just really, just interesting stops along your journey, and I think that's what is probably why it's so exciting with you having your own place and now taking the culmination of all of that and what does that look like through your mind's eye. And another experience that you had too was also with the modernist. And tell me about that experience and how did link that together with your the stops along your journey.
Yeah, well, when Nathan, who was a regular sort of guest of ours at the Fat Duck, and he was really traveling around and going to El Bulli at the time and Mugaritz and all the great place. He was spending a lot of time going around the world and really looking at what everyone was doing. This was a really exciting period. I think it's worth noting that like basically between 2005 and 2011 there was a really, really sort of amplified sort of modernist movement in food, and everyone was pushing some really interesting innovations. It was a very exciting time. There was a lot of these like congresses that were being held all around the world to sort of like share techniques. People were innovating at a very rapid pace and sharing those innovations and sort of owning those innovations. Oftentimes there's a lot of work in this sort of multi-sensory world. I think Ferran Nadria was really in Heston were really sort of pushing, and you had, chefs like Grant Achatz and Wiley Dufresne and that were just innovating. Seiji Yamamoto were just innovating at a very, very rapid, pace. And a lot of that was being influenced by, to be honest, the world of food manufacturing. A lot of that was coming, hydrocolloids like gellan gum or, methylcellulose or things that have been used in food manufacturing were like entering into the sort of lexicon of the culinary world. Techniques like spherification and equipment like sous vide and precision temperature and whatever bricks, refractometers, all these kinds of things were like making a crossover from like either laboratories or like food manufacturing and stuff like freeze drying and centrifuges. And so it was a very sort of interesting time. I sort of liken it to like an art movement. You kind of have a bunch of people who sort of independently and then collectively begin sort of like working on the same path that all sort of pushes that innovation and everything together. So I was very fortunate that I like showed up at the Fat Duck as the first head chef of research and development, and it's just like this world
Wow.
like literally exploded, onto it, and we were like sitting there at this like incredible sort of epicenter of it all, and it was just such an amazing time in my life personally. Of such an enjoyable time of learning and innovating and sort of getting to be a part of that. And then sort of Nathan Myhrvold, was watching that very closely. This is very interested, obviously very, very brilliant, guy in all respects. And, he sort of proposed this idea. I think it was originally proposed as a single book, and then it turned into the volumes. And then we essentially, in the Fat Duck Experimental Kitchen, which was the name of our lab, we kind of split the team in half. And so Chris Young and Sam and, we basically everyone who worked on the original modernist team, and that team has evolved over time, although several of those members are or some of those members are still there. And then Francisco Magoya, he and I were teaching at CIA together, and then he got tapped to be brought in to run it some years later. He and I were working on the bachelor's degree of culinary science at the CIA years later, which was actually born
Right.
out of modernist cuisine. But he was started to create that. So the team kind of left England, moved to Seattle. We sort of rebuilt. I stayed in England. We kind of rebuilt that team, and we assisted from a distance. So kind of built a whole new team in the experimental kitchen. Then after that, we kind of had our second wave in and then after 5 years at the Duck, I moved back to California, moved to Sonoma to start working on what would eventually become SingleThread. And so I kind of caught the last year of modernist cuisine, and then I came in and I worked on sous vide chapter and hydrocolloids. I worked on all the stuff that had to do with Fat Duck, and I worked on a number of items that had to do with Japanese cuisine. And yeah, super rewarding to get to be a part of that. Was pretty special, that team.
And I think as you mentioned, like Farron and Wiley and some of those chefs that were doing a lot of innovative stuff at yourself, with the teams that you were involved with. I remember getting to a point like in fine dining where I kind of thought I was like, okay, well, how much further can this go? It's like, this is what fine dining is, and there was almost a point where it's like maybe it was getting a little tired that it was like, okay, white tablecloth, tasting menus, all this. And then, as you mentioned, like this whole new like innovation. Like, I don't know, I remember seeing Farron's book for the first time, and I'm like, whoa, what is this?
Yeah.
And but what it's really kind of taught me is that, the evolution will always continue. And to look at, the style of cooking, I believe it was the Denobe, the vessels that you're using, that you're cooking with, and the experiences that you're creating, really different than what you would associate with like fine dining or great dining. It's just like the evolution, it just kind of continues, which kind of leads me into this next question. I just noticed on the social media feeds, and we've talked a little bit about this on email. Tell me a little bit about the project with, is it Through Line? Tell me a little bit about that because it looks really awesome just from everything that I've seen from some of the posts.
Yeah, thanks. Throughline is a new project that we're innovating at SingleThread now. And really the sort of genesis of this idea was, every night in the restaurant, we're putting a plate of food in front of a guest, 10 courses. And, we've got 30 or 40 seconds to sort of explain what's going on, with the dish. And that ends up being a sort of list of ingredients and techniques and, what it's all about. And but you don't have very long to explain it to the guests before it starts getting cold. They need to get back to their conversation. You want to keep the night flowing for them. You don't want to create this dissertation, for them about, the dish, and you want to make it fun. So, but we kind of have walked away from that, for the last 8 years saying, man, we're really not doing a great job in sharing with them what it takes and what's behind this dish in terms of where the ingredients come from. And I don't mean like our cooking and our techniques are us. I'm really saying like the artisans, the craftspeople, the sustainable fisheries, our farm, whatever it is, like it's like the guest sees the end result of all of this work, and they see us cooking and working on the dish, but they don't see what's behind that. And what's behind that for us is the most meaningful part. And so, these relationships, and then the work that people are doing, and oftentimes there's very important environmental work, cultural work, social work that's happening, behind the scenes, whether that's about the sustainable seafood fisheries in Japan that we work really close with, our like, farming practices and their sort of regenerative farming, movement, the craftspeople that we work with, that I spend a lot of time with, the artists who make our dishware and, various things, many of which are a multi-generational, thing. You mentioned the donabe, which is This is Japanese earthenware that we get for an eighth, now turning into the ninth generation family in a very rural part of Japan called Iga. And so I mean, it was so important. I spent 2 years writing a book about, Japanese earthenware and this family with a good friend of mine, Naoko-san, who's an absolute expert in these. And so these artists and craftspeople, and a lot of this work is that, like I said, it's either really important what's going on in terms of sustainable, seafood, or the sea urchin divers and the abalone farmers in along the California coastline. And not only are they providing these delicious ingredients, but they're doing incredible work restoring the habitat that has been destroyed due to the over fishing of abalone, which has had the sea urchin move in very invasively. We lost the otters, which are the natural predator, and the sea urchins are destroying the kelp forests along the California coastline. And so here you are as a guest eating delicious sea urchin from Santa Barbara, eating delicious, abalone from there as well. And you have no idea what's going on behind the scenes of that. And, it's basically the business that the divers and the abalone fishermen are in, or farmers are in, really is to serve this incredible and a very, very important sort of conservation work that's going on. And as a guest, you're sitting there, you're eating and enjoying what you perceive as luxury ingredients. But behind the scenes, it's really a means to an end to do some really sort of important work. Of course, there's a business there, but if that business didn't exist, they would not be able to do the important work that they're doing in the sort of conservation space. And it's very hard to drop a dish in front of a guest and explain that to them.
Right.
It took me several minutes, and I'm just scratching the surface to tell you. And so, we sort of realized that there was all these like stories that were being untold. And so what we decided, to do was to do a new dining experience, which is like a 14-seat sort of U-shaped omakase style counter with a screen behind it. And we are serving a 12-course menu with 8 short documentary films in between. So guests arrive, we kind of set up the concept of what they're going to do. They all arrive at the same time. We play an introduction film, which sort of explains like what I just said in a very visual way. And then we combine films about specific topics. And then when that film is over and the lights come on, that next dish pertains to that film. So if you just watched the film about the abalone farmers and the sea urchin divers, when the lights come on, we're preparing you a dish using that abalone and sea urchin. And then we're continuing the story live and verbally. So you're watching a short documentary that's sort of showing, introducing, and explaining, and then we're continuing that live. And we have a film that shows all the work that we're doing with sustainable fisheries all around Japan, because we're working directly with the Ministry of Agriculture, Forests, and Fisheries. They're now on their sustainable seafood program. So, we're showing you where, responsibly raised hamachi comes from that you take for granted when you go into any sushi bar and are able to get, mad-eye, scallops, because we lived in a scallop fishing village in Hokkaido. And awamori salmon from awamori that's caught using underwater cameras so that they are very selective in terms of the different spawning grounds that these salmon go to. So it uses underwater cameras to recognize their scale patterns and harvest in a really sort of responsible way. So we're kind of showing these films, and then we're serving you the dish and go back and forth. And we're continuing that conversation. Guests are able to then have they're able to ask questions because it's live, and it's happening. And in that way, you're not really disrupting their dining experience. You're sort of enhancing that by sort of educating and entertaining at the same time, and it all works together. So we've been doing that. So we did that for 2 weeks in Park City, and now we're heading out to New York. We're doing that for a few nights in the city, up at the Wildflower Farm, upstate New York, a Joe Bearish property. And then we're going to do 2 weeks in Los Angeles and a couple days in Hawaii. And we're kind of moving this around and then like really working on turning this into a permanent experience.
Wow. Very cool. I mean, I can see how obviously on one hand it does kind of serve a cause where it's educating people about very relevant, important things that otherwise they probably never would even hear about. But I can see from a guest perspective that you're actually kind of creating like an experience that's like engaging and, like I would enjoy doing that. It's like it's not it's still, like I was saying earlier, almost like that evolution of dining. And I there was a point where I kind of didn't want to use the term fine dining because it kind of almost kind of had like a people kind of pictured a certain experience, but it's almost like great dining. Like what is
Yeah.
that? And and I don't know, evoking an emotion and making it engaging like that. I just think it just sounds like it sounds really cool. And everything I've seen, I encourage people to look at it, look it up on your social media feed because everything I've seen, it looks really very well done. And I'm excited to see how that continues to evolve.
Yeah, thanks. It's a lot of fun, and also, we'll say it's. I think we're inundated with like things that feel like are bad news or situations that are meant or portrayed as very hopeless or something like that. And that the other thing was just to like showcase there are so many people doing really good work that really are moving the needle, and they're changing things. And I think about these multi-generational fisheries that I spent a lot of time visiting in Japan, and they're like, this is what it was like for my grandfather, then this is the way they did it, and then my father, and then this is the way they did it, and now this is the way it is for me. And we're changing everything about what we do because they like, it's not the same. Like this has changed, and they recognize that that things need to change, and they're doing positive work. And I think we're sort of told a lot by the way that our media works is that that like these things are just not happening. They're not and I think I find that the people who are doing the best work are sort of doing it very quietly. Like they're
Yeah.
just not being recognized for the incredible work that we want to do. So we want to show, like, yeah, there's a lot of work to do. This isn't about, it's not doom and gloom, but at the same time, it's very real. Like it's very realistic. It's like, and it's what we want guests to leave is feeling like, I mean, one, that they had an amazing experience. Obviously, that's the number one goal. But to be honest, like the real goal is that they leave and say, not that I have to look up these people and go and support these people specifically, but it's just to say like, okay, well, I've just, I've never thought about things like that. So in my daily life, how can I seek these things out? How can I be asking the right questions? How can I make sure that I'm supporting, the good food systems or, whatever the case may be, and thinking about, well, maybe I should go to the farmer's market and engage with that local farmer rather than just, going down and buying some non-seasonal produce that's been trucked in from who knows or flown in from who knows where, maybe rather than just going and like just buying my plates for my house at some place where they were stamped out in a factory. It's like maybe I should go like check out that pottery shop
Right.
and studio that I've driven by a million times and never gone in. Or it's just things like that. It's just hopefully to affect some good change in that respect, in the way that people think about how they sort of vote with their dollars.
Yeah, I think I was seeing on another video interview that you had done talking about the plates, and it's kind of like if you don't support a lot of these, smaller systems, these smaller businesses, and they go away, it's not likely they'll ever come back, and
They're
so
not coming back.
yeah,
Yeah.
preserving that, and again, the people mobilizing and really kind of making that something that's important. And I know just even like with us here in Northern Virginia, we have Roots 657 restaurant, and there's a whole area of the restaurant that we have the market over there as well, but they also sell a lot of product that are just set aside on consignment for other small business owners to put all their product over there. And it's kind of like opened my eyes to like, oh wow, I didn't even know people even made that here locally. And so, but yeah, that stuff is could very easily go away if it's not supported by the community and the public. Um, so how do you looking at because I mean, it's like you have like such a, you know, diverse when you kind of look at the ecosystem of culinary training, and you've got like, this Japanese cuisine experience, very disciplined, a lot of, execution and tradition. And then over here you have this like innovation. I mean, like at the highest level with, the fat duck and the whole modernist and Michel Bras, with the expression and style on the plate. How does like a young culinarian, what is your advice as far as like how do you um balance that? Somebody going into, maybe they want to open up a restaurant, like, do you cook sous vide or do you, I know you use some of the live fire and all that stuff. Like, how do you, find your voice as like a culinarian? What would be your advice to like a young chef, or, maybe not a young chef, just a chef trying to figure out like what's my style going to be? I mean, how do you balance that?
Yeah, I think we're all products of all of our experiences, right? My number one piece of advice for for young chefs is like find a place that actually cares about your your education and your experience in sort of mentorship. And if that is at a a place working for a kind of great chef at a high level, Michelin star level or something like that, that's great. And if that is at a a restaurant in your neighborhood where you're really going to get to learn to cook and get access to and lots of different techniques, and someone who really sort of cares about teaching and showing you, that's great too. And it can be a combination of those things, as it can very typically is. And so I always say, like, number one piece of advice is like seek out good mentorship, right? Young in your career, work for people who care about you learning and progressing. And and I think ultimately we all become these kind of culminations of all the experiences that that we have. I mean, I definitely am that, and can sort of point to sort of anything that we do, and like in very easy to trace it back and say where that came from, where that that learning, that teaching, that influence, that inspiration, whatever it is, not just in the cooking, but in sort of like the why behind anything and everything that we do. My wife, the same in her farming. And so, um, I think getting varied experience is really, important. And it's like, they were like, okay, well, you cook California and then you cook Japanese, traditional Japanese cuisine and sushi and kaiseki, and then French cuisine, but in Japan. And then this modernist cuisine, in England and stuff. Like, that seems like a lot of very unrelated things. And it's like, there are certain unrelated things for sure that are, are varied, but I think as we progress and we get older, we look for the connectivity. At least I do. It's like I look for the connectivity. Like I said, it's like, well, what from this is similar to that? How is this the same lesson and the same philosophy, but just told from different perspectives? And it's like, I'm always like looking for, for that connectivity, and now ultimately have sort of put that together in that sort of culmination of these things that is now what we do at SingleThread, and what it is that that we're known for, which is really it brings all of these. I don't think it mashes them together. It brings them together. And so I'm very, you asked about cooking techniques, and I would say I'm very agnostic to to techniques. Back then we were talking a little about this like modernist cuisine movement, and there was a lot of controversy at times with between old techniques, traditional techniques, and these modernist techniques or these modernist ingredients. And that it was like this idea that you had to be on one side or the other. Are you with them? Or are you with us? Like, it was
Right.
there's a sort of weird moment in there that I find very confusing, because it's like everything is always in evolution, right? At some point, everything was new technology, right? It was like, people juiced lemons by hand, and then they used a citrus reamer, and then they used a press juicer,
Right.
and then they used an electric juicer, right? It's like at the end of the day, and this is actually a quote that Heston used to say about this subject. So I did not make this up, but it's like at the end of the day, you get lemon juice, right? And so that was the way that he would always, talk about it. And I believe the same, right? At some point, the oven, the stove, the everything was like new and innovative, technology, the refrigerator. And so, right, those things are going to continue to evolve in that way. But what I love to do in our cooking is like try to seamlessly combine those things. Like, we could have something that has like a sous vide step, like earlier in the cooking process, and then we're finishing it in a donabe or in a clay pot or directly over the the in the hearth, over almond wood or something like that. And so, we have combi ovens and donabes and sous vide and open hearth. And
That's cool.
we are using very, very traditional, dashi sort of sauces that are super ancient. And then we're using high and low acyl gelling gum to get a certain, texture on a fluid gel, right? So it's like it's it's all about it. Is the end result make sense? Is the dish good? Is the flavor good? Does it seem, is it a seamless experience for the guest, or do they feel like you're all over the place? And so, I think that's if the one thing that I see is that when chefs are inspired by different things, they can oftentimes pull it together in a very fragmented way that feels like we're turning left, now we're turning right, now we're turning left again. And so I think it's ultimately, when you want to, as a chef, create your own cuisine and your own style, is you really think about it as like, what is my goal? What am I trying to say? What am I trying to do? What is authentic to me? And then how can that speak authentically? If you're just trying to show off or show off a technique, I think that reads through. And so you really have to look from within and say, who am I as a chef and what am I trying to say?
Awesome. Well, I know we're getting close here on time. I just got one one more question. Well, two real quick. One is I'm just curious as to your perspective on handling fish when you get it in. I know in the last couple years, there's been a big movement toward like the aging and some people hanging their fish and that. I'm curious as how you handle it. And then also, just the final question would be, having gone back to Japan and visiting there, is there anything that you kind of crave when you go back there that's like I don't know, maybe it's like a comfort food to you or whatever? Anything you just, man, I can't wait to get back there to have this.
Yeah. Yeah, on the handling of fish, all of our we basically source fish from two places, either here locally, which I kind of call from like Santa Barbara up to Mendocino, but a lot is coming from Sonoma, black cod, salmon, Dungeness crab. A lot of that is from here in local fisheries that we know really well. And then, yeah, the rest is really coming from Japan. And again, these are fisheries that I work with directly. So I don't use any like companies or anything like that I sort of buy from on the state side. Everything is done directly in Japan, and then I have a broker who's in Toyosu Market who sort of
Wow.
aggregates everything, and then they put it actually on a United flight. And it's I have a courier who picks it up and like takes it through the inspection and then and brings it up, and we kind of set up a little kind of co-op system of that and sort of delivers to a few to a few people. So it's all direct. I message with everyone on WhatsApp and we set it all up through there. So we're getting things specifically to our specification. I know the fisheries that it comes from. It's vetted, for sustainability. Um, there's a lot of funny business, unfortunately, that happens in the world of seafood, which is why I'm actually doing a lot of this work is really, my main concern is on sustainability, but in what comes hand in hand with sustainability is traceability. And so knowing where seafood actually comes from, that it is what it says it is, there's a whole sort of, like set of things around that's a whole different conversation in that. So when we get it, we have really great sort of like timelines because there's no one in between.
Right.
So it's just coming into Toyosu and then coming straight into us and us. So it doesn't change. There's no changing of hands. And so it's incredibly fresh. That's happening 2 to 3 times a week, depending on the week and the products that we're getting in. And I have to be honest, I'm not a huge personally, I'm a huge proponent on the fish aging, the longer term fish aging. I certainly understand the science, behind it and what the flavor development is and the breakdown and everything like that. It doesn't fit my personal flavor profile. I think some people are pushing the limits. I do think some people are pushing the limits too far. As we do when we come up with something new and innovative, we try to see how far we can push it. So I totally get that that's part of it. I'm personally not aligned with it for my own tastes. That being said, I think the handling and really because we're getting a lot of things like, pre-rigor. I mean, I'm getting a lot of things ikejime, so we're kind of ready to go in a pre-rigor state or in a rigored state to where we need to have, some amount of aging for both texture and flavor. I think the Western palate for fish textures versus the Japanese palate are very different. And I think we try to strike a good balance of what that is. And I'm sort of very aware of what my guest, sort of palate calibration is sort of like. And I sort of tend to that trend towards that myself even oftentimes. And so it's not like a sort of compromise in any way. And we in all of our butchery techniques we use all really like the Japanese methods and and tools for cutting. A lot of sort of short preservations in terms of salting and kombu jimes and that type of thing. So I think preparation wise, shiokoji kind of curing and things like that, I think our methods of sort of treating the fish in between the butchery and the final dish are fairly traditional to Japanese techniques. And then sorry, so there was fish, and then sorry, the second part of that question
Yeah, I'm
was,
just curious if there's anything that you think of as kind of like a craveable
oh
thing that
yeah,
you always think about it.
yeah.
Man, I can't
I
wait to
mean,
get some of this.
sure. I'm in Japan about 3 or 4 times a year, and I kind of have my routine. I take a specific flight in the morning that gets me there at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So by the time I get to the hotel or wherever I'm going and sort of check in, it's dinner time. And I always have sushi that first night, just because it's like I crave sushi in Japan. It's also like the best post-flight,
Yeah.
helps me get through and to sleep, and then I can kick off the next day, and I'm sort of like on schedule. So I think it's like I know and anticipate, and I always like try to plan a really great, meal like in the Ginza or somewhere in Tokyo. And so oftentimes I go back to the same places like Hakoku, which I've probably been 12 times, and I love and Chef Sato-san's a kind of young chef. I've been following his career since before he owned his own restaurant. But then I also love to check out, places that I haven't been before, or, circle back to places that I haven't been in a few years. But yeah, I think it's interesting. I think it's because I'm around Japanese ingredients and food like every day. But it just hits so differently there. And it
Right.
is something different about having to be prepared for by somebody else. I mean, we have Japanese food for family meal, I would say probably 4 out of the 7 days at SingleThread. And we cook a lot of Japanese food at home, donburis and hot pots, donabes, and that sort of thing. But it's like it just hits differently, there. And, I kind of love to go and have like this sort of smaller, really niche, types of things. To be honest, I don't eat a lot of ramen anymore. I just find it's like very rich and salty and everything. So I'm always like trying to like look for, those little smaller like niche things. And things are just done so well, and I have like my little places that I like to go, for various things. And I think I just crave to like the full immersion, in it, like in the culture and the food and the language, and everything. And it's like, even things like coffee and bread and pastries are just elevated to such a
Yeah.
high level that it's just, and I just love to see for chefs, it's just become such a mecca. Like going back to the beginning to bring this kind of full circle, I think when I was growing up and I was a young chef, everyone just wanted to get to France and Italy, and I get it, like it's amazing. I love those places too, and I always have, and I'm always excited to go to those places. And I was just such an outlier of wanting to go to Japan, and now I just love to see it's like it's everyone's bucket list. Chefs are always going there. People are taking so much inspiration, and the cuisine and the culture in Japan is just thriving so much. I'm actually going in June. I'm cooking with, kind of mentor and hero of mine, Yoshihiro Murata of Kikunoi, which I staged at for over the course of many years for many, many, many weeks at a time. Kind of a long story, but I was actually going to work for him next in Kyoto, and which is how I met Heston through him, and that sent my life in a whole different trajectory. But
Wow.
this chef who's been my mentor for years, he's kind of the godfather of kaiseki cuisine in Kyoto, and he's sort of the one who started the conversation and with the West sort of opened it up. And I was kind of in the right place in the right time, when that started to happen. And he came to SingleThread this year and cooked with us, which is the first time he'd ever cooked in the US. Probably the biggest honor of my career to have him make the journey all the way from Kyoto to here. He's in his 70s now, to come out and cook. Just a mind-blowing experience for myself and the whole team. And then he invited us to come out and cook there this year, which is like even a greater honor. I think to be welcomed back. It's sort of interesting as sort of to come full circle. It's like, what we're talking about, bashing my head in for so long, just trying to get in the door there, and then finally got in the door there and just working, and that such harsh, very harsh, like very challenging, I was there for it and I didn't expect anything less, but very, very tough environment, to work in, but loved it. And now, I wouldn't have believed as a young chef that I would have been welcome back to come and cook for my own restaurant at an actual three-star kaiseki restaurant in Kyoto.
That's pretty
I
cool.
don't think 19 or 20-year-old me, or even in my 20s, would have believed that that would have ever even been,
Yes, like full
possible.
circle.
So, I think it also says a lot for American cuisine too, not just a single thread is, and I remind the team of this all the time, is to say, like we're a young country, we're a young cuisine culture, and we have chefs like Charlie Trotter and Thomas Keller and various others, who have helped elevate the American cuisine. And there's a lot of French-born chefs and foreign-born chefs, as well. But in terms of truly American-born, chefs, it's there was a generation before you and I who really sort of opened the doors and began to, sort of like elevate that and make that possible. The fact that,
Absolutely.
you know, Grant Achatz and myself and, other, chefs are now have three Michelin star restaurants, and John Shields, are American born, chefs. I mean, if you look at three-star chefs in America, actually, like half of them are not from the US, Dominique Crins from France, and
Yeah, that's true.
Daniel Hume is from Switzerland, right? And so, they have certainly elevated American cuisine, but like we're really just that second generation of American-born chefs who are really helping to get the respect of the right. The world has not had the respect for us in terms of our own, our own cuisine, and a lot of, we stand on the shoulders of a lot of people who have done, amazing work to be able, to do that. And to the fact that, we're able to go back to, a place like Japan or get welcomed, into Europe, to do that, to represent not only what us as a restaurant, but all of, the state of California and our, our whole country. Like that's definitely not lost on me how truly special that is, and certainly take a lot of pride in that.
Well, man, that is awesome, Kyle. I mean, just the entire story, everything that you've shared with us today, and I, I've always kind of had the, always, forever the student, no matter how much you learn, there's always more out there. And even just talking with you, doing some research, just deeper dive with your background prior to us having the podcast today, has inspired me to want to. I'm going to go get a Denobe and check out the cookbook. I mean, it's just really cool kind of hearing you kind of talk about your path. And I just think it's just such a really unique story that you've had. So I hope that we have some time this year to be able to connect again in person. And really, man, I just thank you again for spending some time and
Yeah.
sharing your story with us.
Thanks for having me on, and appreciate your questions. Those are some really awesome questions. It's like always fun to sort of like really dive into that. So appreciate your time.
Absolutely.